Welcome to Idea to IPO. Hello, I'm Jennifer. Idea to IPO has been hosting tech startup events in Silicon Valley for many, many years. We organize venture capital, panels, legal workshops, networking events, and more. Check out our schedule at ideatoipo.com. At this point, I will hand it over to our distinguished moderator, Roger Royce. Roger, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. And thank all of you panelists and all of you attendees who are still joining, I see. So before we get started with the panel, it gives us a chance to go through a couple of housekeeping details. I'm Roger Royce. I'm a partner, corporate and tax with Haynes Boone in Palo Alto, California, heart of Silicon Valley. And I want to thank ID to IPO for hosting and organizing this event, this Investing in Space Tech panel. It's one we've been wanting to do for a long time. And with what's happened in the news over the last few months, there's certainly been a lot of interest in space now. It actually looks real. Looks like we could actually be there. Just ask Kamala Harris. We'll be on the moon someday looking at craters. Not me, I'm too old, but the rest of you in the audience will be. So again, I'm Roger Royce. I'm your moderator. This is an investment panel by Idea to IPO. If you are tweeting, tweet to hashtag Idea to IPO. I am going to put that in the chat box along with my information, and feel free to use the chat box to chat and to put your LinkedIn information, your email, anything if you want to be able to network with people just like I did just now. And make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can watch a recording of this panel along with all of the other awesome panels that we do on behalf of Idea to IPO. The way this will go is we have a 1-hour panel discussion. We've got a big panel, but who have a lot to say, I'm sure, but we're going to mix it up for an hour and everybody will get their chance. And then we're going to have I'm not as old as William Shatner, okay? You don't know that. Then we're going to have a 1.5-hour Q&A session. And during the Q&A session, go ahead and gather up your questions during the panel. Put them in the Q&A box. Don't put them in the chat box. Put them in the Q&A box so I don't have so many things to have to think about and juggle. And we'll get to your questions at the end of the presentation. Before we do that, I'd like to know who is in the audience. So who do we have out there? Do we have entrepreneurs? Do we have investors? Do we have industry people, technologists, service providers like me? Anybody from academia? Any press here today? Go ahead and answer the poll. I'll leave it open for a little bit, maybe a minute, just to get a sense. So far, it is, well, we have more investors than normal. I see that, but so far we have a lot of startup entrepreneurs. About 40% startup entrepreneurs. We have a lot of people who are just really interested in the technology, a little more than usual. And that's good because this sort of information will actually inform a lot of what I think the panel is going to want to talk about and which direction we go on this. So feel free to complete the panel. We've got about 60% participation. We can do a little better than that, can't we, folks? We have a better panel if we know who's out there. It looks like mostly startup entrepreneurs, some investors, about 20%, a few industry people, quite a few technology people. We've got some service providers and we've got some academics. All right, so 38% startup entrepreneurs, as usual. All right, awesome. Hold on here, I'm not finished though. I have another poll. Actually, I take it back. I don't. I usually ask where people are from, but people can put that in the chat box. It looks like it's mostly a North American audience today. So as I said, we're going to start. We're going to talk for an hour. Then we're going to have a Q&A session. If you miss it, if you registered after the session, you're going to get an email from me where you'll get a copy of the recording of this session that you can view later, along with some other goodies. So with that, what I'd like to do is introduce our panel before we get started. And then I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves in a little more detail. Celine, oh man, Goicoechea?
Goicoechea, yeah.
Okay, from Lockheed Martin is here, and we've talked before. Thanks for being here, Celine. Megan Crawford, Space Fund.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yep. Matt Kozlov from Techstars. Daryl D Pietro, Future Stuff. And are the rest of our panelists here yet? Actually, not yet, but they will be, believe it or not. If you are here, raise your hand. Okay, don't see you. Some of our panelists might have come in as attendees, and if so, you need to let me know. And use the hand raise feature if you want to get my attention. But I want to get started, even though we don't have everybody here yet. So first of all, let's start with you, Celine. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you do at Lockheed Martin?
Absolutely. So again, my name is Celine Goicoechea, and I work in the Strategic Transactions Group within Lockheed Martin Space. This means that I work on M&A deals, venture capital investments, as well as joint ventures within LM Space. Prior to working at Lockheed Martin, I spent most of my career working in finance, doing investments for nonprofits and family offices.
Okay, thanks very much. Megan?
Hi, yes, my name is Megan Crawford. I am managing partner of Space Fund. We're a venture capital firm that invests exclusively in the space startup ecosystem. We are currently working out of our second fund and have 19 companies in the portfolio to date. These range from very early seed investments all the way to, we recently did a deal that was a convertible note to an IPO. So we do kind of run the gamut of everything that you guys are looking at here, from idea to IPO, including our recently launched Venture Studio Incubator, which really does help to kind of take those ideas from the idea stage through to kind of a seed fundraise. So we are very focused on helping the space ecosystem grow and working with companies at every stage along the process.
Okay, thank you. Daryl.
Yes, I am Daryl D Pietro. I am the founder of Future Stuff Incorporated. It's a technology development firm that's currently working primarily in the blockchain space and analyzing the intersection between space technology and blockchain. We also have an NFT division, and we're also working on some supply chain solutions that kind of popped up during COVID. I've been building and selling companies since 2005 in the entertainment and technology spaces.
Okay, and Matt from Techstars.
Hey guys, Matt Kozlov with Techstars. We are one of the most active seed investors in the world across many industries, but especially space. So I started the Techstars Space Accelerator a few years back with Lockheed Martin, with the United States Air Force, NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, and a few other partners. Techstars has now invested in over 50 space tech companies, which makes us, I think, one of the largest or most active space tech investors in the world, and actually have quite a few companies in common with many of the panelists here.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everybody. Well, let's start off just kind of level setting a little bit, and for my benefit as well. How do we define space tech? How big a tent is this? And especially for you investors, if for example, Megan, you're a space fund. I mean, you're investing in space. How big is that? Does that include robotics? Does it include autonomous vehicles? Does it include satellites, I assume, software, blockchain? What's all involved in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is everything, right? Everything under the sun is technically included in space in some way or another. But we do have to have some rails and draw some bounds there a little bit. So globally, the technical space industry is about a $300 billion industry right now. The majority of that is satellite communications. One thing that I think is a very common misperception about this industry is people see launch as kind of the most exciting thing, right? It's the big shiny object in the space industry, but that only accounts for about 1.5% of the global space economy. And so there's a lot more to it than launch. You have to think about, well, what is being launched? Yes, that's satellites. Yes, those satellites use advanced computing hardware. They use advanced robotics and AI. you know, if you think about the Starlink constellation, for example, that's going to be a minimum of just over 3,000 satellites. How do you control 3,000 satellites flying in formation? Well, that requires some very interesting artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. You know, and then we also think about humans going to space and the biological ramifications of that. And so there's really kind of a lot of aspects that this touches. You know, the pharmaceuticals being made in space and taking, you know, advantage of the unique environment for unique protein growth scenarios. Manufacturing in space, all kinds of things perform differently in microgravity. And so there really are kind of endless possibilities here. And one of the things I like to say to contextualize this from an investment perspective is that this is the only investment sector that has truly unlimited growth potential. The universe is unlimited in the number of resources and the amount of space. And so this industry can literally grow forever and continue to put up those great financial results as well.
Awesome. How about the rest of our panel? Do you define it similarly? Matt, in particular, I know you're an investor in space.
Yeah, I mean, Megan's answer was awesome. I don't know if I have much to add. I mean, there are so many different touch points between commercial, civil, and military, which are sort of the three categories that we usually look at. And, you know, any given company you might look at could have applications in all three. There are a lot of companies we're investing in that might have applications. You mentioned autonomous vehicles. Well, maybe software that you're using to control a drone might actually be extremely relevant in controlling a swarm of satellites as well. Semiconductors that might be put into flexible applications here might be super relevant for satellites or missiles. And so you see a lot of technologies that we're investing in that can be really broadly applicable. And you know, when you think about satellites, even that is really just it's a computer or a camera in the sky. And what is it doing? It's usually transferring data and taking pictures of things on Earth that we use for terrestrial applications like farming and environmental monitoring. So space really is super broad, and there are a lot of different customers for it. Now, I have seen some reports that, you know, go so far as to call like Uber a space company. And yes, they use GPS, and yes, phones use a lot of space, but we usually sort of we do have a boundary. Like, you know, if it's using a service that's so commoditized or commodified, then we usually say, okay, that's maybe no longer super relevant for us. That's maybe more of a consumer application.
Yeah. Celine, what's the corporate view of this sector?
Absolutely. So honestly, I would absolutely echo what Megan and Matt just said. It's an incredibly broad sector, and as technology advances, the market only becomes broader. But here at Lockheed Martin Space, we're incredibly customer focused, and we work on everything that helps customer missions of today and tomorrow. And we're always very interested in pursuing novel technologies that will help our customer missions.
Okay, can you talk about specific technologies, or is that?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, it's really program based, as you can imagine.
Okay. Daryl, there's one thing I didn't hear so far, and I've been taking notes, and I got a long list of all the things I've heard that space tech, but there's one thing I haven't heard, and that's blockchain.
Absolutely. And so just to touch on what everybody just said, it's so broad, the space sector. But if you look at it from the systems that exist on Earth for the economy, for finance, for tourism, there's such an opportunity in space right now to build out these systems. And so, you know, you're looking at how do you pay for things in space? What are you going to do when you get to space? How are we going to get people up there? And one thing that Megan always says is, you know, nobody stays if nobody pays. And so you've got to get customers, and you've got to get this economics rolling out there. And right now, the existing solutions involve wiring money from one bank to another, sending a comm down and taking days to transact to space. And if you can turn that into a blockchain solution, which is one of the things that we're working on, it ends up being an instant transaction, and the transaction lives in space. And so it has this whole new regulatory framework that you don't have to really worry about the things that you normally need to worry about on Earth. And so it's really a big opportunity from people in the finance and especially the decentralized finance sector to be able to get their hands up there, get their working algorithms and nodes deployed up there so that we can create this off-world economy, this off-world tourism, and this off-world environment that gets people to want to go up there. And I think Megan said this on a call a couple of weeks ago, but it's like at some point you're going to have a family that decides, are we going to go to Disneyland or are we going to go to space? And that's really what we're looking at, is the space tourism and the economy and building out these systems so that you can actually do things in space.
You know, it's funny you should say that. 20 or 30 years ago, I remember we used to draft documents with broad clauses about what law applies and what claims are released. And we'd say things like claims anywhere in the known universe. And we'd all laugh because the known universe was the Earth, and it always would be. I mean, why would you ever have anything going on outside Earth? But it's not so funny anymore, is it? It's possible, and in fact, it's here. So I totally get that, especially the extra regulatory aspects of it. But let me ask you, how big a sector is this? You said 300 billion. How much is that's? I think Megan said 300 billion, and that sounds like the amount of how big the industry is. How big is it as an investment sector? Is it a thing? I mean, can you call it an investment sector at this point?
Oh, absolutely. Matt mentioned that they've made over 50 investments. We've made nearly 20 investments. Dylan Taylor, who I think is the most prolific space investor in the world, has over 100 space companies in his portfolio. And so, there's rampant opportunity here right now. We're currently tracking over 3,000 space startups around the world. That's just the ones we know about. So there's probably double that or more out there that we haven't encountered yet. And so, we honestly can't raise capital fast enough for the opportunities that we have to deploy right now. There is so much innovation going on here and so much opportunity to capture value in these completely new markets. It's like a land grab of the Old West, right? Whoever gets there first gets the proceeds. The investment sector is growing as rapidly and as quickly as the industry is right now. When we founded Space Fund back in 2018, we were the first strictly space-focused VC fund on the planet. Seraphim Capital, our good friends across the pond in the UK, they're aerospace, so it's a little bit different. They do drones and planes and things like that. But in 2018, we were the first space-focused VC on the planet. I've now lost track of how many there are. There's well over a dozen space-focused venture capital funds that we've encountered. And so the investment community has definitely woken up to the opportunity at play here.
Megan, are you a little later stage or is it all pretty early stage?
We run the gamut. We, again, our incubator that we just founded deals with companies at the idea stage. And a recent deal that we did was a convertible note to an IPO. We expect that IPO to happen in Q1 of next year. So we will work with companies at pretty much any stage as long as they fit within our thesis.
Yeah, well, Matt, I know you're early stage. I'm guessing Techstars is early stage, and I'm guessing this is probably a pretty early industry, isn't it? So there's a lot of early opportunities, a lot of consolidation yet.
Yes, we generally are investing at the seed and pre-seed stage, although we occasionally get later stage companies that do our programs as well. Going back to some of Megan's comments, we've been investing in the space sector for quite some time. I think Skywatch and Kepler were two of our early investments. Slingshot Aerospace was another one. The sector, I think just in the last 3 years, has been really generating a lot of opportunity across the entire spectrum. So, we're seeing a lot of SPACs now and IPOs now that didn't exist 3 years ago, which is creating liquidity for a lot of the earlier stage seed investors. Back in 2018, when I was just starting the space program back then as well, I didn't see actually that same level of liquidity, and was one of my concerns. Where do these companies ultimately go? But in the last year, there have been, I don't know, Megan, was it like a half dozen to a dozen IPOs and SPACs?
I think we're at 9. I think we're at 9 SPACs so far this year in the space industry, and counting, right? They keep coming. So yeah, I remember you and I had a cup of coffee once in LA where we had this exact conversation. I think it was back in 2018, is are we going to see any exits? And this has been a phenomenal year for that.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So there has been some consolidation. Is it a mature industry then? Would we call it that?
No,
mean-
I think my opinion is that it's still very, very early stage and there's still a ton of opportunity. We haven't seen a ton of consolidation. There's two primary firms, Voyager Space and Redwire, that have started to do some consolidation and kind of a private equity type of environment. We are starting to see, and I'll let Celine talk to this, a lot of interest from the aerospace primes. As they're trying to, acquire these technologies that they need to fulfill their programs that they're doing with the US government. And so we're starting to see some good activity there, but it's still very early days from my perspective.
Okay. I just want to remind our audience, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A box. We're going to get to them at the end of the hour. So let's go ahead and collect your questions and just hold on, we'll get to them. How about that, Celine? Is that right? Is there are companies like yours driving now some of the activity and the interest in the space, so to speak?
I don't know if I could say that we're driving it, but we're certainly very excited to see a lot of the growing interest, even amongst the general public, in space. And we absolutely think it's a growing market. We really like to partner, however, with generally companies that are more early stage. And, the venture investments that we tend to make are usually in companies that are developing some product or service that addresses some business need that our customers may have. And we love to work closely with these startups and to help collaborate with them in the future. And, I'm happy to give you an example here of that. So, for example, in 2018, Lockheed Martin was selected by the UK government to help the UK Space Agency build their first commercial spaceport, as well as to do their first orbital rocket launch. And then in 2019, if you're familiar with that, we invested in ABL, which is a developer of low-cost launch vehicles and launch systems for the small sat industry. And we partnered with them with the goal of helping advance their development. And then in February of this year, actually, we announced that we're going to contract ABL to supply a rocket and associated launch services for the UK's first orbital rocket launch. And I believe that's set to take place in 2022 in Scotland. So you kind of see that process kind of make full circle here. And it's a great outcome for all parties involved, where we're able to, help invest in an up and coming startup and be able to forge these partnerships with our customers and help our customers succeed in their missions.
Okay. Daryl, any exits in your corner of the world that might be fueling some interest in blockchain in space?
It's actually interesting that you say that. It's quite the opposite. It seems as if there's a lot of blockchain companies that are trying to incorporate space to gain market traction. And that's the issue that I'm noticing. And I think Megan and I have had lengthy discussions about this, about, you throw space tech on your blockchain company and all of a sudden your value goes up. But realistically, are these the teams that can actually execute on this? And typically these are kids in board shorts and flip-flops that are running around trying to, tokenize memes off the moon. And it's like, okay, stay within the parameters, stay within the rails, and we can actually build something. And so you have to, you always have to look at the tech, the team, and the timing and see if it's actually something that they can execute on. And so, for us, blockchain being not a mature market, blockchain being something that's still very early stage and with the world not really understanding the necessity for it, these crypto geniuses are thinking, oh, I can just add space to this and then we'll build on it. And so it's quite the opposite. We're seeing, companies that really aren't doing anything, but they're getting traction because they're adding space to it. So it's going to be exciting to see, who can actually build and who can actually execute once these, once launches actually happen and once things actually go into space and once these nodes get deployed.
Okay. Well, let me shift gears here a little bit. We've got mostly entrepreneurs in our audience here. I'm guessing a lot of them are doing stuff like this or thinking about doing stuff like this or wondering if they're even, going to be on your radar at some point. And I always ask panels of venture capitalists, gee, what do you look for in a startup? And then they say, gee, that's such an old question. Why can't you ask something original? But I'm going to ask it now because I think space tech startups must be a little bit different. To me, it would seem that it's much more hard science based, but that's just my impression. Am I right about that? Is there anything different about a space tech company than other startups that you might look at to get your attention, to get you excited about it? And Matt, you're not muted, so I'm going to see if you
Yeah,
say something.
yeah. I mean, these are not, companies building an app for, consumer use. There's a lot that can go wrong. And if you don't have the credibility and the team around you to actually execute against your vision, you're going nowhere fast. And we see a lot of startups that have grand, lofty goals and no real concrete way to get there. And even companies who come to us saying, hey, we need $5 million to build this thing and we can't do anything until we raise at least $5 million. That's just a chicken and egg problem. It's never going to go anywhere. And so we are looking for companies that can show a clear path around, we're doing this amount of work to get to this milestone, and then we need this amount to get to the next milestone. And they have realistic goals. They have, in some cases, a way to get non-dilutive grant funding. They understand their customer, and they're good at asking for help. But I don't think there's one space tech company that I've invested in that didn't have the technical expertise and credibility to do what they said they were going to do.
And Matt's totally right there. There's, something that I like to talk about a lot that Daryl was touching on a moment ago, the magic space sprinkles, right? Where you add space to your company and now all of a sudden the valuation's 100x and investors are chomping at the bit. There's a lot of noise in this industry, like with any young industry, like with blockchain as well. I mean, there's a lot of people who have a lot of ideas. Can they implement those ideas is really fundamentally what it comes down to. And so to help cut through that noise, Space Fund started publishing a couple of years ago something that we call our reality ratings. And these Space Fund reality ratings, or SFRs, are available for everybody to go view on our website on spacefund.com. And we're going through every one of our sectors of investment interest. We catalog every company that we can find in that sector, and then we rate them on how real they are, based on a combination of factors, including technology. Does it break any laws of physics? Our friends over at DARPA like to say, if a proposal breaks one law of physics, fine, but 2 laws of physics, that's taking it too far, right? So, obviously there's the technology aspect. The team, is the team capable of implementing? And have they hit the market, or are they going to hit the market at the right time to be successful? And so we combine those all into this single score, kind of a 1 to 9 rating. And you can go look right now, we're tracking, I think it's 163, it might be up to 165 now, launch companies from around the world. And so you can take a look at that launch database and see how they're rated. And you realize that most of them are very early stage. Most of them have very low ratings. Not to say that they won't grow into a highly rated company, but that's just a factor of how young the industry is overall. But what's not as interesting to me as the fact that there's 165 launch companies, what's really interesting to me is investment sectors where we see the potential for a lot of value creation, where there's only 5 companies or 10 companies. That's where there's room for disruption. And that's where entrepreneurs should be focusing on creating solutions, not just trying to do another Me Too rocket company. Please don't start another rocket company. We've got more than enough. Focus on what products and services not only the rocket companies need, but the satellites that are being launched. We expect 100,000 satellites to launch in the next 7 to 10 years. What are the products and services that all 100,000 of those satellites are going to need? That's where there's room for disruption right now. And that's where all of these big entrepreneurial brains should be focused, in my opinion.
Interesting. Celine, I got to believe that you're a little more science focused than that, just because of my experience with corporate. Am I right?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say we're more science focused, but I would say is one of the tremendous advantages of sitting within Lockheed Martin Space, of course, is the interactions that we're able to have with my team and, so many of the engineers within Lockheed Martin Space. When we invest in a company, we really want to partner with them and help them develop and be able to find ways to marry their innovative technology with one of our complicated customer missions. And it is really wonderful to see the interactions between our engineers and the founders or engineers at these startups, and they come together and they create really great solutions for clients.
Okay, so it sounds a little more product-y, I guess, right?
It's really wonderful that, from where I sit every day, I'm able to have interactions and, call an engineer kind of, what is that? Who wants to be a millionaire, dial a friend option to ask some leading experts in the field within Lockheed Martin if I ever have a question on investment or how best we can, implement a certain solution. So definitely an advantage position we have there.
And that's, I think, a really important point. And I know because I've been an advisor to Techstars, I know that Matt does this as well, but we have a very deep and strong network of advisors. We have to, because as we discussed at the top, space touches so many different technology areas that no one person or no group of fund managers could ever be an expert in all of those different technologies. And so you have to have that kind of both deep and wide advisor network that you can call on to help with the due diligence when it comes to the science and the technology of these companies.
And to add to that, I am very humble in my idiocy. Like, I am not an expert. And I think by just putting that out there and then relying on all the amazing people that we work with at Lockheed and JPL and the Air Force and our friends at Space Fund to get their input allows us to be better investors, because we just check our ego at the door.
Interesting. Hey, Matt, you said something earlier that I want us to shift gears again that I found really interesting. You mentioned non-dilutive grant funding. And for our entrepreneurs in the audience, is that a big thing in this area?
Oh yeah, it's huge. It's probably the only reason why I thought that this program would make sense in 2018, because the Air Force in particular was overhauling how they work with startups through their SBIR program. They've been handing out hundreds of millions of dollars in grants to US-owned startups at the seed stage and have a very nice structured program. And it's not just the Air Force. I mean, NASA has a SBIR program as well. So does the Department of Energy, but the Air Force in particular has been maturing and spending a lot of time and money on growing commercial startups.
And we've seen that as well, and that's a huge part of what we do. The both Air Force and Space Force, they have programs called AFWorks and SpaceWorks respectively. We work directly with those programs and often provide matching funds. And so this is a really innovative program that I've not seen other parts of the government do. Maybe I'm just unaware of it, but for the Air Force, for example, and a venture capital fund to both provide capital at the same time to accelerate technology development reduces risk on both sides. Because the government can come in and say, the government wants this product and we're willing to fund it. But one customer does not a company make, right? You've got to have that signal from the commercial market as well. And as the venture capitalists, we're very in tune with that commercial market. And so having those two signals in parallel, that both commercial and government are interested in the product or service, de-risks the project from both perspectives. And so we love to do what they call the StratFi, TACFi funding, where we do those matching funds. It's been very, very valuable to us from the fund perspective.
And is it a large number of your portfolio companies actually have this sort of funding as well?
I can only think of one portfolio company that doesn't, because they're more commercial, they're more consumer based. I think every one of our other portfolio companies has had some sort of government funding at some stage, whether it was directly matching funds or an SBIR that kicked off technology development before the VCs came in, or vice versa. But pretty much every company in the portfolio has received some sort of non-dilutive grant funding from the US government, or the UK government, or the Luxembourg government, depending on where they're located. I don't want to leave out our non-US portfolio companies, but Luxembourg and the UK specifically are doing a great job of doing kind of the same thing within their own countries. And we're starting to see countries around the world do this. I was very surprised to learn that Argentina has a very robust space economy and that their government is investing heavily. We have 2 Argentinian founders in our portfolio. And so, yeah, this is really growing around the world, but I think the US government through the Air Force really innovated here and helped really create the growth and excitement that we see today. We owe our friends at the Air Force, who are now some of them at the Space Force, we owe them a big round of applause.
Yeah, and just last point on this, you said it was matching. Are these typically matching funds? So the company has to find an investor as well?
Yes, and so there's different categories of government grants require different types of matching. In one instance, we wrote a $50,000 check that unlocked $750,000 from the government. I'll do that deal all day. That is an amazing leverage, right? And then other times it's one-to-one matching, right? It just depends on the mechanism that the government's using and the requirements of the company and how much capital they need to be successful.
Got it. Well, there you go, Daryl. And now we know why your blockchain companies are calling themselves space tech companies, right?
Absolutely. And for us, like we use this exact same information when we look to partner with people. If they've got this strategic financing, or if they're highly rated on Megan's reality rating, that's a huge indicator that it's going to be a successful partnership. And so, you have to kind of navigate the waters with, we're not going to waste our time, because if you think about it, if we're partnering with a company, if we're developing technology for a company, it's essentially investing in them. And so you don't want to waste your time investing in a company that's going to go belly up or can't actually execute. So Megan's reality rating has definitely helped us navigate a few partnerships along the way. And then also knowing that, if you don't get that government funding, it's a huge indicator that your company's probably not going to be successful. So, this is definitely something that we're tracking and looking at substantially.
Wow. Well, it's important then.
I think a follow-up to that's really important too. We recently made an investment decision to not invest in a company because although they had received several SBIR phase 1s, they had never received a phase 2. And so the government does these in phases, phase 1, 2, and 3 SBIRs. And you can have a whole bunch of great ideas and get a whole bunch of small checks from the government for your ideas. But if you're not able to implement, if you're not able to move on to that next level, into that phase 2 SBIR, where there's real funding in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, that's a red light for us, right? And so that's the kind of execution part, right? Idea to execution. And so the government can also be a good way that we kind of test the waters on that execution capability as well.
They're doing some of your diligence for you, I guess, huh?
Absolutely. We're sharing our diligence capabilities, let's say.
To echo on everyone's point on kind of the reliance on things like SBIR's grants for these startups, given that, space is such a capital intensive industry. Obviously, we're very grateful for all the government funding and helping these startups, really take off. But at the same time, I at least am very excited to see some of the spin outs that come out of some of these larger companies, particularly as they have large fundraisers or liquidity events. I certainly think it's possible that after some of these liquidity events, we might see a trend of an increasing number of very experienced and talented folks who leave these companies to become startup founders themselves, as was the case, for example, with Google or LinkedIn or any other of those tech titans. And I think it's also possible that, given the sheer number of these liquidity events and the size of them, that it's possible that these startup founders may be able to start self-funded with founder capital, at least initially. So I think that's another interesting trend that we might see as the space economy further develops.
Yeah, we've seen a couple instances of that, not so much from the funding perspective, but these kind of Gen 2 entrepreneurs, whether they were successful or failed at their first startup, a lot of lessons learned. One of our shared portfolio companies has a great story about that. The founder who had a previous company that He learned a lot of valuable lessons and then was able to start a new company that has been, infinitely more successful. So failures and successes can both provide really good lessons, but this industry is old enough now that we are starting to see a few of those Gen 2 entrepreneurs who are really hitting some things out of the park. Keeping in mind, I like to say that the space startup ecosystem, or new space as we call it, really started the day that Elon had his first successful launch, and that was in 2008. And so we're more than a decade in now. Prior to that success, the idea, and no offense to Celine, that if you weren't Boeing or Lockheed, you couldn't do anything in space was a pretty prevailing idea. And that first moment that a private, non-government funded, although he did get some NASA funding along the way, company got to space, sent a signal that brought in a whole bunch of other entrepreneurs and started bringing in some funding. And so for me, that was the pivotal moment. But the point is that we're, more than a decade on here, we are starting to see the value of a lot of those lessons learned coming back into the ecosystem.
We lose somebody. Okay, interesting. I was reading just this morning that there's been about $50 billion per year in bootstrap capital in these companies. So what you were saying about founder funding actually kind of makes sense. You expect founders are going to have to put some of their own money into these companies, but there's an easier path to getting government funding in the meantime. Let me ask you something else. It seems to me as I'm listening to this, and and especially the timing, that a lot of this sector has grown up during the COVID era. When we see people dispersed all over the world, just look at our audience here. We used to do these events and everybody was within a 20-mile or even 10-mile radius of me. Now we're all over the world. And you said you had invested in 2 Argentinian companies already, Megan. Is there a center? Is there a space tech capital? Is there a place people should be? Or does it not really matter for investors? What do you think?
So there's no one center, right? A lot of industries, they do have that one place where you've got to be in order to be in the game. I'm in Houston. I like to refer to Houston as Space City. That's how we refer to ourselves. We do have a lot of activity here, and there's hotspots. There's really good hotspots in Florida around Kennedy Space Center, in Colorado, in Silicon Valley in LA, in Seattle, here in the States. We're starting to see some interesting activity in Boston, things coming out of MIT. Other hotspots in the world, Luxembourg and the UK, primarily because their governments have been so concentrated on developing these capabilities. We're starting to see a ton of activity in Asia, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, lots of activity in South America, activity in Africa, Australia. This is truly a global industry, and we have companies and employees from all over the world that are participating at every level of the supply chain. I think that's the case for a lot of industries, post-COVID especially. But this industry has been global in nature for a long time, even before the startup ecosystem really took off. And so I think that's provided these great kind of pools of capital around the world of experienced engineers who have maybe had a great career at Space Systems L'Oreal or SES or one of these big European companies. Now they're getting that entrepreneurial bug and going to start new startups. And so we're definitely truly a global industry. And I even know of some of our teams that are cross-Atlantic or cross-Pacific teams within a company. So thank you, Zoom, for allowing this world to exist.
The rest of you agree with that? Any dissent?
Absolutely. In our sector specifically, we've always kind of been distributed, and now the world is aligning with that. And so it makes it a lot easier to conduct business. And I think that Megan's absolutely right. There's hotspots, but as we evolve into this, post-COVID Zoom world, it's going to get a lot more distributed.
Okay. Well, I'd like to drill down on a couple of specific applications, if you don't mind, because you have convinced me there's a lot, and I was taking good notes on a couple of things caught my ear that I just personally am very curious about. Number one, mining. I hear people talk a lot about space mining. Is that really a thing? And how would that work? And why would we want to mine in space?
I think I have to take this one, and then I'll let Matt and Celine take the next couple. So by way of background, I was Chief Operating Officer at Deep Space Industries, which was an asteroid mining firm that was sold in 2018, right before we decided to set up the fund. And so I do this, this one's near and dear to my heart. And so, yes, I do believe that there is a very real future of mining in space. In fact, we're working with a company right now called Off-World that has created autonomous AI-based mining robots for here on Earth to take people out of mines, right? It's one of the most dangerous jobs you can have on the planet. Strip mining is also one of the most environmentally harmful things that we do to the planet. And by using these, AI robots, we can eliminate the danger to humanity and, reduce a lot of the harmful things for the planet. Those are being specifically positioned, those robots, for space mining. They were trying to solve the problem of space mining, where you have to have these robots that work by themselves because you might have long travel times for communication. And so by trying to solve this problem about space mining, they solved this really impactful problem for us here on Earth. We see that in a lot of instances across the industry and a lot of applications, but this one specifically I thought was very poignant for your question. So it's one of the things I always like to say, as a venture capitalist, we have a 10-year fund lifetime like most VCs do. Do I believe that in space mining and resource utilization is going to be profitable enough to exit within the lifetime of my current fund? Probably not. Maybe if you squint at it a little bit, but I do think it's coming and that it's definitely a future that we need to be preparing for.
What exactly is being mined up there? Sorry for the dumb
Water.
question. What's that?
No, it's a great question. It's a great question. People think, and you see these headlines, asteroid passing Earth that's worth $73 trillion because of all the platinum in it, sensationalist headlines, right? You see those all the time, but that's in fact not the case. The gold or the oil of the solar system is water. Hydrogen and oxygen makes rocket fuel. And so our shared portfolio company, Orbit Fab, are putting fuel depots in space right now to refuel satellites and to refuel launch vehicles as they move farther out into the solar system. In the not too distant future, the water that is being used to be turned into that propellant will be mined from water ice on the moon and asteroids. So that's really the low-hanging fruit and the first and earliest use case for space mining. But also, we live in a world now of 3D printed everything. So being able to use lunar regolith, the dust on the moon, and turn that into feedstock for a 3D printer. Imagine how much easier that would make the lives of the astronauts who are going to be living and working on the moon in the next decade, right? So I think there's a lot of potential there as the industry progresses.
Okay, here's another one for you, space waste. And everything I know about space, I saw in movies. And I remember seeing that the space waste is up there now, and there's getting to be more and more of it. Are there companies and technologies that are dealing with that problem? And have you invested in any of them? Or is it even a problem? Maybe space is just so big that it doesn't exist.
No, I mean, Celine can probably answer this better than I can. But
I was going to say it's a tremendous problem. I mean, as of right now, there's about 23,000 pieces of space debris larger than a softball orbiting the Earth. And there's almost infinitely more pieces of debris that are too small and too numerous to count. And to give you an idea, these objects travel at, I think it's like 16,000 miles per hour at LEO. And a speed that is just so fast that it's been shown that even a fleck of paint can cause damage to, space vehicles out there. So it's certainly a problem, but I would say, at least as of right now, I would call it a bit of a tragedy of the common scenario, as the debris obviously has a negative effect on all of us, and yet the responsibility for it is a little bit unclear as of right now.
there are some really interesting companies. One is called ClearSpace, another is called Deorbit. These are companies actually building hardware to clean up some of the debris. And there are a lot of software companies like Kaon Space that are trying to do more collaborative tracking of the debris so that satellites can maneuver around it. And we actually, that's another piece. You need, as the debris becomes more and more problematic, you need to equip satellites with the capability to maneuver and to avoid some of the problematic collateral up there. So, it's creating an evolving landscape where, it is becoming a major problem. But right now, it's the business of governments to primarily, fund the removal, and we'll have to probably evolve more regulations and better space policy to prevent the problem from getting worse.
As Matt and Celine both mentioned, the responsibility aspect of this is what it comes down to from an economics perspective. Who is going to pay for the debris removal? There has not yet been a successful business case that has crossed my desk. And trust me, I'm looking for one. I want one. I want a space debris removal business case that closes, but I haven't seen one yet, because it comes down to this fundamental question: is who's going to pay for the cleanup, right? There's nobody paying space taxes to go out and cover the cost of your space street sweeper, right? And so until some policy regime is implemented that accounts for how this is going to be paid for, there's not going to be a definitive, clear, easy solution. And this is going to have to be done very much on an international level. Right now, the US Air Force is where most of the data comes from about tracking all of these pieces of debris and all of the active satellites. There's no international body that's doing that. The US Air Force does this as a service to the community because they need the data anyway, right? And it's in everybody's best interest to avoid satellite collisions that would create more debris. And so, yeah, there's definitely some work to be done there on the international regulatory side. The concern is that those sorts of conversations move so slowly, and we need to start implementing solutions now. And so this is what one of my technical advisors refers to as the screen door problem. You have a screen door on your sliding glass door at home. You can see through it, but you can't actually get through it, because there's so many little tiny pieces, right? Eventually, we're gonna have a problem where we're not going to be able to launch satellites anymore, because the launch vehicles won't be able to get up through LEO because there's so much debris and so many satellites already there. So this is something that folks within the industry have been concerned about for a long time. There are some innovative solutions coming out from a technical perspective, but until we have the regulatory and finance side worked out, this is going to continue to be an issue for the industry.
Interesting. So in the last couple of minutes, the question that's on everybody's mind is about space travel. Now you have to be a billionaire to go into space, I guess, or a movie star. In my lifetime, is there going to be such a thing as space tourism and travel? Or do I have to become a billionaire? That's my question.
Absolutely not. So I'll do another plug for a portfolio company. The one I mentioned earlier that doesn't have any government grants is Space Perspective. And they're using high altitude balloons to take consumers to the edge of space. Yes, you can book a multi-million-dollar ride with Blue Origin or SpaceX, but you can also have a very different experience going up to the edge of space for $150,000, right? And so that's obviously not affordable to most people on the planet, but it's much more affordable than several $1 million. And we've seen that price come down just in 2 years. It's gone from being multi-million dollars to get to space to $100,000 to get to space. So if we have that same order of magnitude price reduction over the next, call it 5 to 7 years, now you're talking about a $10,000 or $15,000 opportunity to go to space. That's as much as a Disney World vacation costs. So that starts to become really affordable over time. Just like with any industry, as innovation continues, as competition continues to increase, we will see those prices come down. And as a point of reference, when the space shuttle was operating, the cost of getting a kilogram of volume to orbit was $20,000 a kilogram. That's now down to as low as $1,000 a kilogram. Thank you, SpaceX. And so, that again, if we have another order of magnitude reduction like that, spaceflight becomes a very, very affordable option.
Okay, well, with that, I want to open it up to the questions. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A box, not the chat box, and we'll get to it. But before we do that, I want to thank our panel for being here. That was really interesting. I could sit here and ask you questions for hours, but I think I'm going to give the audience an opportunity to do so. First question, hello, everybody. I know the answer to that one. It's hello back. All right, here's a substantive question. We're developing a battery and solar thin film technology for station keeping drones to take the place of low Earth orbit satellites at a lower cost. I know you know what that means. Let me get to the end here. I don't see a question in there, do you? Disrupting the relationships. Well, let's pause on that for a minute anyway before we move on. Some of these technologies, it just seems like this is such a big tent. There's just so many different technologies that go into it. I'm just wondering how you folks as investors manage to stay on top of. I mean, I got about 3 words into this before I started to have to look for my dictionary. How do you stay on top of just the knowledge gap and the technology challenges of knowing enough about this to be a sophisticated investor? It seems to be much harder in this space than it would in a lot of other industries.
That's really true. One of the things, besides just the jargon, of which there is a lot, there are so many acronyms. This industry loves acronyms. Everything is an acronym for something else. And so that's really hard to keep on top of too, trying to remember what all the acronyms mean, although they are a useful device for, for kind of cutting through. But yeah, and again, going back to the previous discussion, Matt said it best, check your ego at the door and rely on your advisors and your team to help you get through it, because nobody can be an expert on everything in this industry.
Yeah, and I have to say, I think it's about being a sponge. I think when you first start to learn about all these things, and again, using your advisors and building the right team around you so that you don't necessarily need to know everything at the beginning and inception point, but then you start to learn this and just absorb more information. And I think that's the way that this industry evolves.
Okay. So if anyone wants to comment on the question, that's fine. Okay, do you feel that startups will squander investor funding and underdeliver on products or services? Kind of a broad question, but it's out there, so we should maybe take it.
Some do. I mean, this is a high risk industry, and I have seen space startups put a satellite in orbit and then lose the satellite, lose comms with their spacecraft, and weren't able to recover. I mean, things like that do happen. And that makes investors unhappy. So, you have to think through every possible scenario and be overly cautious. I've had companies delay their launch by 6-9 months because it wasn't exactly right and they didn't want to take that risk, and I respect that. Do we have enough data now, or is it too soon to have an idea of just how risky a sector this is and how many, what the success to failure ratio is, et cetera? I mean, I have a pretty good idea just generally of how likely it is a random typical startup is to succeed, but I don't know about a space tech startup. Maybe it's like you say, it's, you have a 10-year fund and a lot of this stuff is going to take longer than 10 years. Do we got anecdotal evidence or data or a gut instinct about how safe
this, like with any startup industry, and you really nailed it, Roger, there's just a high risk involved in startups by the nature of them being startups. But beyond that, the industry does have some unique risks related to launch, related to failures on orbit. One really common one is solar panels not deploying appropriately. And so, but again, any industry has technical risk, and once those risks are well known, you can help mitigate against them. One stat that I think is really interesting that I read recently is that SpaceX has had over 100 successful launches in a row with not a single launch failure. ULA has a similar performance capability. So the risk and launch, which, to a lot of people is kind of the riskiest part of all of this, that has gone down so significantly over the last decade that, we're starting to see these de-risking strategies, mitigation strategies working. Also, we're very fond of insurance in this industry and redundancy. We love redundancy in space, right? So why build one when you can have two for twice the price? So there are definitely some unique things to be concerned about here, but I don't think that it makes it any more high risk than any other, early stage technology area.
How do the rest of you feel about this?
I mean, Megan said it perfectly, and it's parallel to any startup industry. It's like you make bets, and you don't necessarily know, especially if you're in the idea stage or seed stage. It's like need to know that you lay 10 bets out, and you just need to return 1 or 2 of those to make the fund, and then the rest of them, if they are profitable, excellent. But you have this risk reward scenario where you're not going to be 100% successful on the capital that you deploy. So it's kind of like going into it knowing that you make calculated bets is the best way to put it. And, you'll be successful on some, but you may not be successful on all of them.
Okay, so if you have questions out there, don't put them in the chat box, put them in the Q&A box. And as a general rule, a question should end with a question mark, and we'll take them. Here's a really good one. Are there any regulatory barriers that need to change to address the growing commercial space industry? Changing those takes time, and who wants to invest in something that depends on a rule change, right? And I guess this isn't so much like Uber or Airbnb where you can just do it first and ask for forgiveness later, right? You better have a good legal basis before you start investing that kind of money. That's a risk that a lot of companies just don't have, that you have to deal with. What about that?
One of the unique risks in this industry is regulatory risk. A lot of other venture capitalists, a lot of my friends who work in other VC and other industries don't even have regulatory risk on their list, right? But it's a really high one. And I understand this not wanting to invest in companies that require some sort of regulatory change. I experienced that firsthand when I was working at Deep Space Industries. At that time, asteroid mining was still technically illegal, according to the Outer Space Treaty that had been signed in the UN, I believe, in the 1960s. The US was actually very accommodating and passed a law that made asteroid mining legal for US companies and persons. And that passed, I think in 2016, something like that. And so we are seeing change. The regulators here know that things need to get better. One thing that I think people have just now started talking about that I've been concerned about for a couple of years, but because the regulators are starting to think ahead and be so responsive, they're starting to have these conversations now. Right now, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, governs satellites on orbit because you have to register the spectrum of radio frequency that you're using to communicate with your satellite. And because that's a radio frequency, it's governed by the Federal Communications Commission. Great. What happens when those communications to and from the satellites are happening via laser, via optical communication? That's not governed by the FCC. Who then gives that satellite a license to operate? And so, and the industry is switching to optical. That process is ongoing as we speak. So creating a new regulatory body, the US is talking about right now, creating a new regulatory body that will govern how satellites are dealt with and governed in space. And that's something that needs to happen. But like with all industries and all governments, the speed of government is usually quite outpaced by the speed of business. And government is typically having to catch up to what businesses are doing. And I think that we will see a little bit of a Wild West out in space where people just do things, ask for forgiveness, not permission, right? So it'll be very interesting to see how it develops.
Any other, Celine, I got to believe you must deal with regulatory issues all day, every day.
Well, yeah, I mean, space, as everyone's been saying, is such a highly regulated industry, and honestly, for good reason. And we certainly have seen, from where we sit, a lot of companies that have faced challenges because of this. For example, Momentous, I believe it was their founder, right, had to step down due to CFIUS regulations. And as Megan mentioned, earlier, right now the UN is working on modernizing the Outer Space Treaty. And one of the things that personally I find interesting is part of their modernization efforts is dealing with kind of the ownership of space debris. My understanding is, as it stands, is in order to deorbit certain satellites or remove space debris, you must first ascertain the owner of that debris. And what they're trying to do now is make an effort so anything that is kind of clearly debris will be delineated legally as such, so anyone could take it down. And I think changes like this, we certainly welcome them, and it's very exciting to see how that'll change the investment landscape.
Yeah, well, that kind of feeds into the next question, which we've talked a little bit about already. Space debris, who's the customer, who's going to pay for this? And it sounds like we don't really have a good scheme in place yet. And there might be a need for some law and some treaties to deal with this
Well,
problem.
Celine just really hit the nail on the head here. Right now, if I were to go try and capture some space debris and that happened to be owned by China and have some sensitive electronics still attached to it, that could start a land war, right? Like that could seriously go really, really, really wrong. So classifying debris as separate from operating satellites is a really valuable first step. But right now, what makes salvage at sea a valuable proposition is because we have salvage rights. And so if I were to go pull up the Nina or the Pinta or the Santa Maria from the ocean floor, I could keep all of those Christopher Columbus gold doubloons that I can find, right? They would belong to me because I've pulled them up off the ocean floor. If we can get similar salvage rights in place in space, now think about that in space 3D printing, in space manufacturing. If I don't have to haul up my raw materials with me, if I can reuse the metal from this debris to create new and useful things in space, that becomes a business case that might close. A big portion of the debris in space is spent upper stages, spent rocket bodies that are just floating around in space. Well, there's enough volume in there to be habitable. You could create a small space station out of one of those if you had the salvage rights to go up and collect and modify those spent upper stages. This really comes down to these regulatory concerns in order to allow the economic case to close.
Yeah, and you hit on another issue. There's more than one country involved here too. So it's got to be an an international agreement on this at some point. Sounds like a lot of hurdles. Here's an interesting one. What are the picks and shovels of the space industry? Is it AI software, rocket fuel, electronic shielding, heat shields, 3D metal printing, etc.? I think what the questioner is getting at is, rather than space travel, which is all over the news, what is the thing that's going to enable all of these other cool industries that might not be around as long? We talked about a lot of them. Are there any that we missed that are worth mentioning?
So we mentioned propulsion. Power is a big one. We talked about, actually, one of your commenters mentioned space solar, thin cell space solar. There's actually a shortage of solar space qualified solar panels to support the types of constellations. So there is opportunity there. Radiation hardened avionics is another big opportunity. Semiconductors in general for these satellites. Space is a very punishing place. A typical computer here won't work there for very long. That's an opportunity because a lot of these satellites are meant to be disposable, but if you want them to last for a while, you've got to design them differently. We've talked about in-space servicing and refueling in particular. That opens up another level of infrastructure that companies can have. Software is a whole nother layer. I don't know how to think of software as a picks and shovels business because it's probably a more complicated thing to think about, but there are a lot of hardware components that are broadly applicable to a lot of the different opportunities people are pursuing.
So think about supply chain as well. I mean, you've got a lot of activities that are going on in space, asteroid mining, moon mining. Talked about, the orbit fab and the rocket fuel. How do you know that that's actually happening? How are you tracking all these things? And what systems are going to be in place to actually execute in space with trust and provenance and scarcity and all the things that come into play when you're doing this? You need to have those systems and that infrastructure set up. Honestly, that's where we feel blockchain comes in to play a huge role in that. But there's a lot of technologies out there that could fulfill that need, but it has to be built, and it has to be built with integrity and trust.
Daryl, going back to the earlier question, you made a comment earlier about how this is an unregulated area for blockchain and what you're doing. And I guess it is, but maybe not. I mean, maybe because it involves people from different countries, on Earth. It sounds like it's an evolving field. Let me just put it that way. It sounds like there's a lot of questions there to be answered, or have they been solved?
So with the regulations, as far as fintech goes, as far as transferring currency and transferring money and policy, if it doesn't come back down to Earth, then it is unregulated. It only becomes regulated and taxable when it comes back down to Earth. So if you send a Bitcoin up to your satellite, and then you want to use that Bitcoin to pay for something in space, as long as that whoever you pay for that, the receiver, the recipient that gets that, and they keep it up there, then it's not a taxable event. And so there's these different caveats that come with space economy and space commerce that I'm sure will get fleshed out, and I'm sure that the government's going to want their piece. And there's probably going to be a day where they're like, well, if you launch from Earth, then you're owned by Earth. And, Megan has touched on this on different panels about, just like if you were to use a boat that ships off of the United States, it's got its call tag, it's tagged United States. So at some point, the governments are going to want to get their hands on this. We know how slow government works. So again, I think touching on what was talked about earlier, it might be a bit of a Wild West for the next couple of years. But as this ramps up, and especially as space tourism and a true space economy ramps up, the government's going to want to get their hands on it.
So speaking of technologies, there's a question about navigation systems. There's a new system of...
That's actually, that was our foray into the space tech industry. And we decided that we wanted to build something like this. And then I met Megan, and Megan said, "Who's your customer?" And I said, "Oh, crap. You do need a customer in order to have a successful company in space, huh?" And so it's a matter of, and Megan can touch on this way more deeply than I can, but navigation, who's your customer, who's paying for it, and how do you actually implement it so that it can become profitable?
So right now, a lot of satellites, in order to navigate, they need to be constantly connected to the Earth, right? And constantly kind of beaming signals back and forth so that the satellite knows where it is. Where I see that there's real room, and that's well understood. Travel times to and from low Earth orbit for communication, especially as we switch from radio frequency to optical. There's not a barrier in the amount of time those signals take to get to and from. But as spacecraft and especially commercial spacecraft start to go beyond the low Earth orbit environment, beyond MEO and GEO, out to cislunar, out to Mars and the asteroids, it becomes much, much harder to do that GPS function, that navigation, that tracking. And so I think we will see some innovative solutions in this space. And to that end, I will say that you can expect a press release next week about that.
You heard it here first. This is a good one, insurance. I hadn't thought about this. Not only a risky business, but at 16,000 miles an hour, I gotta believe it's a really risky business for anybody who has something up there like a satellite. Is this stuff insurable? Is the insurance industry on top of this? Are they dealing with this? And is there an opportunity there? Anybody?
I mean, it's a bajillion-dollar empire. I mean, when Maxar lost their, $300-400 million satellite, it was insured. There's a mature business around insuring all these spacecraft. It's been there for, decades. Munich Re is one of the largest players in the industry. They're one of the biggest insurers of not just space, but lots and lots of different industries. But there's plenty of actuarial models for most of what we're covering. But there's a lot of opportunity for them too. I mean, we've mentioned OrbitFab a few times. Munich Re is an investor in them because if you can prolong the life of a spacecraft and generate more value from it, it's going to make the plan more attractive to Munich Re.
Yes, anything can be insured, right? And they are, okay. So I actually like this question, and this is the right place to ask. Here's somebody who wants to start a career in the space industry and they want to know how to get started. So here we have some space industry veterans, if there's such a thing, that maybe can help him or her out.
I also love this question. I'd say jump in with both feet and don't hesitate. A lot of people get concerned or scared coming into this industry. I know before I jumped in, I thought to myself, well, I'm not a rocket scientist. I'm not an engineer. There's no way that I can be successful in this industry. And that the exact opposite is true. This is a booming industry like any others. And being here in Houston, I like to always tell people, whatever skill set you have that's applicable to oil and gas is probably applicable to space. We need accountants, we need business development, we need marketing. In fact, most of the board of directors meetings that I go to for our portfolio companies, the number one pain point is hiring. I cannot find enough people to take the jobs because this industry is growing so quickly. So jump in, find a place for you, go to the space job boards, go, take a look, get excited. And another really great entry point can often be through the nonprofit world. And that's how I came into the industry. I started volunteering at a nonprofit that did a conference every year and got to meet people because I was organizing the panels. So I got to meet high-level people in the industry. Then I was there at the conference and I was shaking hands and and networking with people. And that volunteer position eventually introduced me to my co-founder at Space Fund, right? That's how we met, was by both volunteering and dedicating our time to that nonprofit. And those folks definitely need your help. So please find a entry point that suits you and come on in. We need you here.
Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to plug two amazing organizations that we've been working with quite a bit. One is called the Zed Factor Fellowship. These are both primarily for women looking to enter the aerospace industry and get mentorship because there's still not nearly enough diversity in this sector. But Zed Factor Fellowship helps place women aerospace engineers into startups, and Brooke Owens Fellowship is another that's just a phenomenal organization, and highly recommend both of them.
Absolutely. And piggyback on your point on diversity in the industry, first of all, I would just like to say that I'm a recent entrant to the industry. I joined Lockheed Martin Space about a year ago, and something that I love about working in space is just how friendly everyone is. And when I reach out to people, even people I don't know, I think they're far more willing to respond to you. And also you're seeing this kind of bloom of so many nonprofits that are working to address the shortage of folks both in STEM and not in STEM in space, as well as the shortage of diverse talent. For example, I'm a mentor at the Houston Ion Project, which is an incredible project to help increase the number of diverse startup founders within space. But one final plug, I always like to help find really great people to work at Lockheed Martin. So please feel free to reach out to me after the panel. I would love to hear from you.
Wow. Okay. Well, before you all leave, I'm going to ask how they get a hold of you.
Oops. Yes.
I'll save that. I'll save that.
Should I type it in the chat or respond?
Type it in the chat. Type it in the chat. It's even better.
Here we go.
Daryl, what do you think? You're the only one who hasn't weighed in on this. Is this a good career to get into, and how do people do it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the big things you need to realize that we've kind of touched on this call is that almost all the industries that we have on Earth are going to be needed in space. And again, like what Megan said, you don't need to be, this rocket scientist. You don't need to be an astrophysicist. You don't need to have this PhD. You can be an entrepreneur. You can be somebody that's running a business that operates on Earth. And as long as there's a need and a use case for it in space, there's going to be an opportunity. So start looking at like the pickaxes and shovels and the systems that we're doing. What are you a subject matter expert on on Earth. How do you apply that to space? And I think that was the aha moment for us. I mean, we were in blockchain for years before we got into the space tech sector. And again, Megan's accelerated that for us along the ways. But, we really had this huge, like, holy cow, all this stuff we've been doing on Earth, with all this competition on Earth, no one in our industry is looking at space the way that we are. And that's really the leg up that you get when you start to realize that, we're going to need everything. We're going to need, everything from entertainment to janitors. You just think about what we're going to need as this economy evolves and over the next, call it 10 years. Megan, I know you want to throw a party on the moon. Who's going to service that party? Where are we going to get the DJs and the food and all the things that you need eventually are going to be needed in space. And so if you look at it from that perspective, it really opens up a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs to get involved.
Any volunteers to DJ that party on the moon?
We already have it covered.
And we got a couple more quick ones here in our last few minutes. They're saying, what else produces high return other than space travel? I guess we could see there's a lot of money in space travel, especially if you're going to be throwing parties on the moon. Quick one, what benefits produces a high rate of return? I guess in the short term, I think is what people are thinking.
In the short term, I see the most value creation opportunity in those pickaxes and shovels, those products and services that all of the satellites are going to need. Matt did a great job of listing a lot of those, everything from the supply chain, all the things needed to build the satellite, to all of the products and services the satellites will need on orbit, whether that's refueling, whether that's dynamic orbit raising in response to a debris threat, whatever the case may be. These 100,000 satellites that are about to launch, they all need things. They all need products and services. And that's where we're seeing a lot of return and a lot of capabilities happening right now in the moment. Another big area that we haven't really touched on today, most of the satellites, they're up there gathering data. They're taking pictures, they're getting radar imagery. Being able to process that data provides a huge amount of opportunity, whether this is processing, storage, and transmission in space and down from space, or whether this is actually getting your hands on the data once it's down on Earth and making it useful to the end user. There's a lot of opportunity in that's really on kind of a software development level. So it's a very low entry point from an economic perspective, but could have very large margins in the long run. So those would be the two areas I would focus on.
Anybody else want to jump in on this? Okay, we have one more question, and it is NanoRacks wants to create a space station from rocket second stage. What's the future of a product like this? What do you think, Matt? Would you invest in that?
I think Megan already touched on this, so I don't feel the need to. I mean, it's okay. In my perspective, that kind of capability is still quite a ways off, but we are seeing some really ambitious companies like Varda that are trying to do some of the things that a year or two ago probably a lot of people wouldn't have touched. But they're raising the capital, and the timing is probably better now than ever. But that type of capability is still, I think, a ways off.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So again, if you want to get a hold of our panelists, they've all, I noticed, entered either their LinkedIn or their email in the chat. So go ahead and go to the chat. I really want to thank our panelists for being here today. Thank you for that. That was a really interesting discussion. I certainly learned a lot. It was a lot of fun. I got the best seat in the house, though. And I want to thank you attendees for sticking in there with us right to the end. And thank you for the questions. Thank you, Rob at Idea to IPO. Thank you, Jennifer. And this is Roger Royce, your moderator. I'm a corporate and tax lawyer with Haynes Boone in Palo Alto, California. And this will conclude the webinar. We will see you next time.